I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I didn't ask why when my sister told me I wasn't welcome at her wedding. I just stood there holding my phone, rereading the message that said it would be better for everyone if I stayed away. As if love could be managed like seating arrangements. As if erasing me would keep the day clean and beautiful. For years I had learned how to disappear quietly, to swallow words, to accept explanations that were never meant to make sense. I told myself this was just another moment I had to endure. But what none of them knew, what no one bothered to ask, was that I was carrying something heavier than hurt. Something documented, something dated, signed, and sealed years ago. I didn't plan revenge. I didn't want apologies. I prepared a box instead. And when my sister unwrapped it in front of everyone she loved, the room finally learned what silence had been protecting all along. Before we continue, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your city. I read every comment. And if stories about quiet strength and delayed justice speak to you, consider subscribing. Sometimes the truth doesn't need a voice. It just needs time. I grew up learning early that love in our house was not divided equally, it was assigned. My parents never said it out loud, never used cruel words, never raised a hand. From the outside, we looked like a perfectly ordinary American family in a quiet suburb. 2 parents who worked hard, 2 daughters who went to good schools, a house with a trimmed lawn and a flag on the porch every 4th of July. Nothing about us looked broken. But inside, everything was measured. Attention, praise, patience. And my sister Emily always measured higher. She was 3 years older than me, bright and charismatic in ways teachers loved. She smiled easily, spoke confidently, and somehow made every room tilt toward her. When she walked into a space, people noticed. When I did, people adjusted their bags to make room. At dinner, my parents asked about her day first. If she talked for 20 minutes, no one interrupted. If I spoke for more than 2, my father would glance at his watch or gently remind me to get to the point. When Emily brought home a B+, my mother reassured her it was still excellent. When I brought home an A, my mother asked what happened on the test. None of it was loud. That was the part that made it hard to explain. If someone had asked me whether my parents loved me, I would have said yes without hesitation. They paid for my clothes. They came to my school events. They remembered my birthday. But love can exist alongside preference, and preference can quietly shape a child's understanding of their worth. Emily was celebrated. I was appreciated. When we were kids, I learned that appreciation meant not making things harder. It meant being easy, cooperative, understanding. When Emily wanted the bigger bedroom, I gave it up without argument. When she chose which movie we watched, I nodded. When my parents needed help with chores or errands, they came to me because I never complained. "You're so mature," my mother used to say, smiling with relief. "You don't need much," my father added, like it was a compliment. Over time, I learned that needing less was the safest way to be loved. By high school, the pattern had settled into something familiar. Emily joined clubs, went to parties, dated boys my parents adored. I focused on my grades. I worked a part-time job. I stayed home. When Emily broke curfew, my parents worried. When I stayed out late studying at the library, no one noticed. I didn't resent her. That's important to say. Emily wasn't cruel growing up. She didn't bully me or mock me. She simply accepted the space she was given the way most people do when the world keeps offering them more. She assumed it was natural that things leaned her way, and I assumed it was natural that they didn't lean mine. When college came, my parents were clear about priorities. They had limited savings, they said. Emily had chosen a private university out of state. It was expensive, but she had so much potential. I was encouraged to stay local, attend a state school, and apply for scholarships. "You're independent," my father told me. "You'll be fine." So I was. I worked 2 jobs during college. I maintained a high GPA. I didn't ask for extra help. When Emily called home, stressed about exams or roommates, my parents listened for hours. When I felt overwhelmed, I reminded myself that I was strong enough to handle it alone. That became my identity, the one who handled things. After graduation, Emily's life accelerated the way everyone expected. She landed a job through a connection. She moved into a city apartment my parents helped furnish. Photos of her smiling on balconies and at brunches appeared constantly on social media. My life moved more quietly. I found steady work. I paid my own rent. I built savings slowly. I visited my parents regularly, brought groceries when they needed them, fixed things around the house. When my mother needed someone to drive her to appointments, she called me. When my father needed help with paperwork, he handed it to me. Emily was busy. I was available. No one ever said this arrangement was unfair. It was simply understood. The older we got, the more permanent the roles felt. Emily was the story my parents told their friends. I was the footnote that made the story possible. When relatives visited, my parents spoke proudly about Emily's job, Emily's apartment, Emily's future. If someone asked about me, my mother smiled and said, "She's doing fine. Very responsible. Very responsible." As if responsibility were a personality instead of a burden. I learned to measure my value by usefulness, by how little trouble I caused, by how much I could absorb without cracking. So when Emily got engaged, none of this surprised me. She announced it during a family dinner, her hand extended across the table, a ring catching the light. My parents cried. My mother stood up and hugged her. My father opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving. I smiled. I congratulated her. I meant it. The months that followed were a blur of wedding planning that revolved entirely around Emily's vision. Venues, colors, guest lists, seating charts. My parents were deeply involved emotionally and financially. Conversations at home shifted fully into wedding mode. I helped where I was asked. I researched vendors. I ran errands. I listened to stress-filled phone calls late at night. I offered calm solutions when emotions ran high. I never assumed I'd have a significant role in the wedding. I didn't expect to be a bridesmaid. I didn't ask. I was used to being adjacent to milestones, not centered in them. Still, I believed quietly, naively, that I would be there. That regardless of everything else, family meant presence. That belief would not last. As the wedding plans moved forward, the distance between Emily's life and mine became more visible, not because she pushed me away, but because everything around her pulled her forward. She moved into a new apartment with her fiancé, Mark, a place with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the river. I helped her pack boxes one weekend, lifting furniture while she coordinated movers on her phone. My parents paid the security deposit without hesitation. When I mentioned my rent had gone up by $300 a month, my father nodded sympathetically and said, "That's the market these days." Emily's engagement party was held at a restaurant downtown. It was elegant and loud and filled with people I didn't know, Mark's colleagues, Emily's friends from work, couples who spoke easily about investments and vacation homes. I stood near the edge of the room holding a drink. I never finished smiling when people asked how I knew the bride. "I'm her sister," I said. They always looked surprised. Not unkind, just surprised. As if they had expected someone louder, someone more like her. My parents floated through the room, glowing with pride. My mother kept introducing Emily as our oldest, her voice thick with emotion. My father shook hands and told the same story over and over about how Mark had proposed during a weekend getaway. No one introduced me. I didn't take it personally. I told myself this was normal. Weddings were about the couple, not the siblings. I was there to support, not to be seen. In the weeks that followed, my role became clearer. I was the problem solver, the extra set of hands, the person Emily called when something went wrong because she knew I would answer calmly and fix it. When a vendor canceled last minute, she called me. When she needed someone to review contracts because they were confusing, she emailed them to me. When my parents felt overwhelmed by decisions, they asked me to mediate. "You're good at this," my mother said one evening as we sat at the kitchen table surrounded by folders. "You don't get emotional." I smiled and kept reading. I didn't tell her that I did get emotional. I just didn't show it anymore. Mark was polite to me, friendly in a distant way. He thanked me for helping, but he never asked me anything personal. He didn't need to. In his world, I existed on the periphery, useful, agreeable, forgettable. Sometimes late at night, I wondered if I should pull back, if I should stop offering help, if I should protect myself from becoming invisible. But habits formed over decades are hard to break, and part of me still believed that being dependable would count for something in the end. As the wedding date got closer, the conversations shifted from logistics to optics. Emily became more careful about how everything looked, who was invited, who sat where, which photos would be shared. She talked about vibes and energy and how she wanted the day to feel clean. That word stuck with me, clean. As if family were clutter that needed managing. One afternoon, about 6 weeks before the wedding, Emily asked me to meet her for coffee. It wasn't unusual. She often needed to talk through last-minute details, but something in her tone felt rehearsed. We sat across from each other at a small cafe near her apartment. She stirred her drink without sipping it. I waited. She finally looked up and said, "I need to talk to you about something kind of uncomfortable." I nodded. I had learned long ago not to react too quickly. She took a breath. "So with the wedding, we're trying to keep things really positive. Low stress. You know how big days can get." "I do," I said. She hesitated. "Some people feel awkward when family dynamics are complicated." I didn't answer. I let the silence do the work. Emily continued. "Mark and I talked, and my parents agree it might be better if you don't attend the ceremony." The words landed softly, but they were sharp. I remember noticing small details in that moment: the sound of the espresso machine, the clink of cups behind the counter, the way Emily avoided my eyes. My body stayed still. My face didn't change. "I'm not invited," I said calmly, more to confirm than to accuse. "It's not personal," she said quickly. "We just don't want any tension." I almost laughed. "Almost. What tension?" I asked. She gestured vaguely. "Just history. People might ask questions. We want the focus to be on us." I thought about everything I had done to make this wedding possible. The hours, the unpaid labor, the quiet support. I thought about how carefully I had managed my presence my entire life to avoid exactly this kind of accusation. "I understand," I said. Her shoulders visibly relaxed. "Thank you. I knew you'd get it." She reached across the table, touching my hand briefly like a transaction completed. My parents called that evening. My mother spoke first. "Honey, we heard about Emily's decision. We know it hurts, but it's just one day," my father added. "You're strong. You'll be okay." I told them it was fine. I told them I didn't want to cause problems. I told them I supported Emily. They thanked me for being understanding. After the call ended, I sat alone in my apartment for a long time. Not crying, not angry, just empty. I realized something then, something I had never allowed myself to fully admit. I had been useful my entire life, but I had never been essential. Being banned from the wedding wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was the logical conclusion of every small decision made before it. I wasn't excluded because I caused drama. I was excluded because I didn't matter enough to risk discomfort. That night, I opened a drawer in my desk. Inside were documents I hadn't looked at in years, papers I had signed quietly, choices I had made without witnesses. I hadn't planned to revisit them. I hadn't planned to involve anyone else. But as I stared at those pages, I understood something with sudden clarity. If I stayed silent forever, the story would never change. And the truth, no matter how carefully hidden, does not disappear. It waits. The days after the ban passed in a strange quiet, like the air after something breaks, but before anyone admits it did, Emily went back to wedding planning as if nothing unusual had happened. Group chats buzzed with updates about floral arrangements and seating charts, threads I was no longer part of, though I still heard about them secondhand through my parents. My mother called to ask if I could help address invitations for out-of-town guests. My father wanted me to review a vendor contract because you're good with details. I did both. Not because I wanted to, because refusing would have required explaining feelings no one had ever asked me about before. At work, I functioned normally. I met deadlines. I answered emails. I smiled in meetings. No one there knew that my own sister had decided I was too inconvenient to witness her marriage. I didn't tell them. The story felt too small and too heavy at the same time. At night, when everything slowed down, the thoughts came back. I replayed the conversation at the cafe over and over, not with anger, but with analysis. I tried to pinpoint the exact moment I could have said something different. Pushed back, asked questions, asserted myself. But every version ended the same way. Emily hadn't asked for my opinion. She had informed me of a decision already approved by everyone who mattered to her. My parents' reaction hurt more than the ban itself. They didn't argue. They didn't negotiate. They didn't suggest alternatives like attending only the reception or sitting quietly in the back. They accepted Emily's choice immediately, as if it were reasonable, even necessary. When I visited them one weekend, my mother avoided the subject entirely. She talked about the weather, about a neighbor's new car, about how busy Emily was. At one point she said, "You know your sister. She just wants peace." I nodded. I wondered when peace had started to mean my absence. That visit ended with me fixing a loose cabinet hinge and taking out the trash before driving back to my apartment alone. As I pulled onto the highway, something inside me shifted, not dramatically, not explosively. It was quieter than that. I stopped hoping things would change on their own. The wedding was 3 weeks away when Emily texted me about the gift registry. "I know you're not coming," she wrote, "but people will still see gifts listed, so just pick something small if you want. No pressure. No pressure." I stared at the message for a long time. Not because I was unsure how to respond, but because I finally understood how completely invisible I had become. My presence was optional. My feelings were irrelevant. Even my generosity was expected to be convenient. I replied politely, "I'll take care of it." And I did, but not in the way she imagined. That night I took the documents out of my desk drawer again. I spread them across my kitchen table, smoothing the edges carefully as if they were fragile. In a way they were. Years earlier, when my parents had faced a serious financial crisis, one they never talked about openly, I had been the one in the room when decisions were made. Emily had been out of state then, busy starting her career. I had been living nearby, working a stable job available. The solution my parents settled on required someone to sign, someone to take responsibility quietly without drawing attention. I had signed without hesitation, not because I was pressured, because it felt like my role. Those papers changed the trajectory of my life in small but significant ways. They delayed things, limited options, redirected money and time. No one had asked me later how it affected me. They had simply assumed I would adapt. And I had. I had never intended to use those documents for leverage. I hadn't even thought of them as evidence. They were just part of the past, a closed chapter. Until Emily told me I didn't belong at her wedding. That was when I realized something important: silence only protects people who are already comfortable. I didn't want to confront her. I didn't want to expose anyone out of spite. I didn't want an argument or an apology staged for guilt. I wanted the truth to exist outside of me. So I decided on a box. Not elaborate, not dramatic, just large enough to hold what mattered. Inside, I placed copies of the documents organized and clearly labeled. I added a short letter, no accusations, no emotional language, just context, dates, facts. I sealed the box and left it on my table for several days. Each time I walked past it, I asked myself if this was necessary, if I was being cruel, if I was crossing a line, but every time the same answer came back. I had already crossed the line years ago, quietly alone for everyone else. The wedding week arrived quickly after that. My parents were busy, exhausted, emotional. Emily was consumed by last-minute details. No one checked in on me. No one asked how I was doing with being excluded, and that told me everything I needed to know. 2 days before the wedding, I arranged for the box to be delivered to the venue. I included instructions with the coordinator. It was a personal gift for the bride to be opened during the reception. There was no malice in the instructions, just clarity. The night before the wedding, I sat alone in my apartment and tried to imagine how the next day would feel. I didn't picture the ceremony. I didn't picture the guests. I pictured silence, mine, and the kind that would finally belong to everyone else. I slept better than I expected, because for the first time in my life I wasn't preparing to be useful. I was preparing to be honest. The morning of the wedding arrived without ceremony for me. There was no alarm set for makeup appointments, no garment bag hanging from my closet door, no schedule taped to the fridge. I woke up naturally, the pale light of early morning spreading across the ceiling, and for a brief moment my body reacted as if something important was supposed to happen. Then I remembered. I lay still, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside my apartment. Somewhere across town, my sister was surrounded by people adjusting her dress, fixing her hair, reminding her to breathe. Somewhere else, my parents were pacing emotional, rehearsing smiles in mirrors. And I was here, exactly where I had been placed. I didn't feel anger when I got out of bed. I felt a strange neutrality, like my emotions had finally decided to stop arguing with reality. I made coffee, slowly, deliberately, as if the rhythm of ordinary actions could ground me. I drank it standing by the window, watching strangers walk their dogs, jog past, unlock their cars. None of them knew this was supposed to be a defining day in my family's life. That anonymity felt like relief. My phone remained silent through the morning. No messages from Emily, no update from my parents. I told myself not to read into it, but the absence still stung. Even after banning me from the wedding, they didn't think to check in. Around 10, I opened the small closet where I had tucked the box away days earlier. It sat on the shelf exactly as I had left it, plain, unmarked, except for my sister's name written carefully on the label. I took it down and set it on the table. For the first time since I prepared it, I allowed myself to open it again. Not to change anything, but to reassure myself that what I was about to do was grounded in truth, not emotion. Inside were copies of documents arranged in order. Dates highlighted, signatures visible, nothing exaggerated, nothing hidden. I reread the short letter I had written, 3 paragraphs, factual, restrained, almost clinical. It explained what the papers were, why they existed, and why I was sharing them now. There were no accusations, no demands, no pleas. I closed the box and taped it shut again. If anyone later claimed I had acted out of bitterness, the contents would contradict them. Late morning, my mother finally called. Her voice was tight, cheerful in a brittle way. "Just touching base," she said. "Things are hectic here." "I figured," I replied. A pause followed. "You're okay?" Today I knew that question well. It wasn't concern, it was risk assessment. She was asking whether I would cause complications even from a distance. "I'm fine," I said, and meant something different than she heard. "That's good," she said quickly. "We're heading to the venue soon. Emily's been nervous." I didn't ask about Emily. I didn't offer advice. I wished my mother a good day and ended the call. It occurred to me then that this might be the last time we spoke before everything changed. Just before noon, I arranged the delivery. I'd already coordinated with the venue earlier in the week, careful to be specific without being dramatic. The instructions were simple. The box was a personal gift for the bride to be presented during the reception along with the others. I wasn't sneaking anything in. I wasn't disrupting the schedule. I was following the rules I had followed my entire life. When the confirmation email came through saying the package had been received, I sat back in my chair and exhaled. There was no rush of triumph, just a quiet finality. The rest of the afternoon stretched ahead of me, strangely empty. I filled it deliberately. I cleaned my apartment. I did laundry. I answered a few emails for work even though it was the weekend. Familiar tasks helped keep my thoughts from spiraling. Around 3, I went for a long walk. The city was busy, restaurants preparing for dinner service, couples dressed nicely, heading out early, laughter spilling from open windows. I passed a bridal party, taking photos in a park, the bride glowing in white, her friends surrounding her. For a brief moment, grief surfaced, not jealousy, not regret, just the simple recognition of what I was missing. I let it pass. By the time I returned home, the ceremony would have already begun. I imagined the music, the vows, the applause. I imagined my parents' faces as they watched Emily walk down the aisle, tears in their eyes. I wondered if they noticed the empty space where I should have been. At 6:30, my phone buzzed. It was my father. I stared at the screen for several seconds before letting it stop ringing. A minute later, a text appeared. "Did you send a package to the venue?" My chest tightened, not with fear, but with awareness. So it had begun. I didn't reply. The phone rang again, this time from my mother. I silenced it. I wasn't avoiding them out of cruelty. I simply understood that anything I said now would interfere with what needed to happen. The documents were doing the talking. My voice would only distract. I placed my phone face down and forced myself to sit still. 10 minutes passed. Then another call. Then several messages in quick succession. "What is going on? Please answer. We need to talk." I turned the phone over and typed a single response. "I sent a gift. That's all." The reply came immediately. "This isn't funny." I almost smiled at that. Not because it was amusing, but because it revealed how little they understood. They thought this was about embarrassment, not accountability. About timing, not truth. I didn't respond again. Sometime later, how much later I couldn't tell, the calls stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, charged with something new. Not confusion anymore. Recognition. Around 9, a message came from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Daniel Harris. I'm an attorney working with your parents. They've asked that you contact me as soon as possible." I read it twice. I had anticipated this step. When facts challenge long-standing narratives, authority gets involved. That wasn't a threat. It was procedure. I replied calmly that I would be available the following afternoon. That night, I cooked myself a simple dinner and ate it slowly. I didn't check my phone again. I didn't speculate about what was happening at the reception, who was saying what, who was panicking. I knew enough. For the first time in years, I wasn't managing anyone else's emotions. I wasn't anticipating reactions or softening edges. I had released something I'd been holding quietly for too long. And as I turned off the lights and went to bed, I realized I wasn't afraid of what came next. Whatever happened after tonight would happen in the open. The morning after the wedding felt heavier than the one before it. I woke up knowing that whatever had happened the night before was no longer theoretical. It had taken shape. It had names and reactions attached to it now. The truth had entered a room full of people who had never expected to hear it. My phone was face down on the nightstand. I left it there while I showered, while I made coffee, while I sat at the table staring at nothing in particular. When I finally turned it over, there were more messages than I could process at once. Some were from my parents. Some from numbers I recognized, only vaguely relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. There were no messages from Emily. That absence said more than anything else. I didn't open any of them immediately. I needed to understand my own state of mind before letting theirs in. For years I had reacted first and processed later. I wasn't going to do that anymore. By mid-morning, I had a voicemail from the attorney Daniel Harris. His tone was neutral, professional, almost careful. He asked me to return his call when convenient. That phrase, when convenient, stood out. For once, no one was demanding urgency from me. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. I called him back shortly after. He answered on the second ring. "Thank you for calling," he said. "I won't take much of your time. I just want to clarify a few things." We spoke calmly. He asked about the documents, where they came from, whether the copies were accurate, whether I had retained originals. I answered truthfully without elaboration. When he asked why I had chosen to reveal them now, I paused. Because pretending they didn't exist was no longer sustainable, I said. There was a brief silence on the line. Then he said, "Understood." He didn't challenge me. He didn't accuse me. He simply explained that the situation had caused complications, that certain assumptions had been disrupted, that emotions were high. I almost laughed at that last part. After the call ended, I finally opened the messages from my parents. My mother's text came first, long and disorganized, swinging between confusion and hurt. "How could you do this at the wedding? We didn't know you felt this way. You should have talked to us." My father's messages were shorter. "This was inappropriate. You embarrassed the family. We need to discuss next steps." I read them without responding. They were reacting to consequences, not causes. They were upset about timing, not truth. And for the first time, I didn't feel obligated to correct them. By the afternoon, I had pieced together enough from the messages to understand what had happened at the reception. Emily had opened the box during the gift portion, smiling, expecting something small and safe. When she realized what it contained, the room had gone quiet. Not awkward, quiet, intent quiet. The kind that settles when people sense they're witnessing something real. My parents had recognized the documents immediately. Others hadn't. Which is why questions started. "What is that? Why does it matter? Why is this being shown now?" Someone, an uncle, I think, had asked if a lawyer should look at it. Someone else had insisted it was inappropriate to discuss during a celebration. Emily had apparently tried to laugh it off at first. That didn't last. Facts have a way of resisting dismissal. Eventually, the attorney present for the wedding, someone Mark's family had hired for unrelated reasons, had stepped in. He confirmed the legitimacy of what he was seeing. He didn't editorialize. He didn't accuse. He simply acknowledged the implications. And in that moment, the narrative my family had carried for years fractured. The next few days were filled with requests. My parents wanted to meet. Emily wanted to talk finally. Extended family members wanted explanations, clarifications, reassurance. Everyone wanted something from me. I gave them very little, not out of cruelty, out of necessity. I agreed to meet my parents first in a neutral place, a small conference room at Daniel Harris's office. I didn't want this conversation happening over a kitchen table where old habits could take over. They arrived tense, my mother clutching her purse, my father stiff with contained anger. They looked older than I remembered, smaller. The attorney sat quietly at the end of the table. My mother spoke first. "Why didn't you tell us how you felt?" I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I did," I said. "I just didn't raise my voice." That landed harder than I expected. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. My father leaned forward. "This didn't need to happen like this." I nodded. "You're right. It didn't. It needed to happen years ago." That was when the pattern finally became visible to them, not as an accusation, but as a timeline. Decisions made, responsibilities assigned, gratitude assumed instead of expressed. They listened. Not defensively, not gracefully, but they listened. Emily refused to attend that meeting. She sent a message later instead. Long, emotional, angry in places, hurt in others. She accused me of betrayal, of stealing her moment, of punishing her for things she didn't fully understand. I didn't reply immediately. When I finally did, it was with one sentence. I didn't take anything from you. I returned something to myself. She didn't respond. Over the next week, the reality settled in. Certain financial arrangements had to be revisited. Assumptions about ownership, responsibility, and obligation were no longer valid. My parents were forced to confront the fact that the stability they had enjoyed for years rested partly on something they had never acknowledged. Publicly, the family was quiet. Privately, things were shifting. I wasn't celebrated, I wasn't praised, but I was no longer invisible, and for the first time, that was enough. In the weeks after the wedding, the noise faded, but the weight remained. The phone stopped ringing as often. Messages became shorter, more cautious. People who had once spoken to me casually now chose their words carefully, as if afraid of triggering something else hidden beneath the surface. I could feel it in conversations, in pauses, in the way silence lingered longer than before. The truth had settled, but it hadn't resolved. Emily stayed distant. She didn't block me, but she didn't reach out either. Her social media went quiet for a while, then returned with carefully curated posts, photos of dinners, scenic views, nothing personal. The comments were polite, supportive, controlled. My parents tried to act normal. They invited me over for dinner one Sunday evening, the first time since the wedding. The house looked the same framed photos on the wall, the same couch cushions arranged neatly, but the atmosphere had shifted. It was as if something invisible had been removed, leaving behind a faint outline of where it used to be. My mother cooked too much food, a nervous habit she'd always had when she didn't know how to fix something emotionally. My father talked about work, about the weather, about anything except the past month. I let them. Halfway through the meal, my mother finally asked, "How have you been?" It was the first time she'd asked that question without adding a qualifier or expectation. "I've been steady," I said. She nodded, eyes down. "We didn't realize how much you carried." That was as close to an apology as she knew how to get. My father cleared his throat. "Your mother and I are working through some things, legally, financially." I waited. "There are documents we should have discussed years ago," he continued. "We assumed you understood." I met his gaze calmly. "I did. I just didn't consent forever." That conversation didn't end in hugs or tears. It ended in quiet acceptance. They were beginning to see me not as a support structure, but as a person with limits. That change mattered more than any apology. Later that week, Daniel Harris contacted me again. He explained that some arrangements needed formal revision. Not because I demanded it, but because they could no longer pretend the original agreements didn't exist. I signed what needed signing. I reviewed what needed reviewing. I didn't gloat. I didn't rush. I had learned patience the hard way. Emily finally reached out 2 weeks after the wedding. Her message was brief. "We should talk. Not about the papers. About us." I stared at the screen for a long time. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to rush toward reconciliation, to restore the image of family harmony that had always been more important than my comfort. But another part of me, the part that had finally learned to stay, still hesitated. "I'm open to talking," I wrote back. "But not to being dismissed," she replied hours later. "Fair." We met at a public place, neutral territory, a quiet cafe halfway between our apartments. No witnesses we knew. No home field advantage. She looked tired. Not just from wedding aftermath, but from disillusionment. The version of herself she had been celebrated for had cracked, and she didn't yet know what would replace it. "I didn't know," she said after we ordered. "About everything. No one told me." "I know," I replied. "That doesn't make it okay," she said quickly. "But I wasn't trying to hurt you." I believed her. That was the complicated truth. "You didn't have to try," I said. "The system did it for you." She flinched, but she didn't argue. We talked for over an hour. About childhood. About assumptions. About how easily comfort turns into blindness. She admitted she'd never questioned why I was always the one available, always the one helping. "I thought you liked it," she said quietly. "I thought I had to," I replied. That was the closest we came to resolution. There were no dramatic apologies, no promises of transformation, just a shared recognition that the story we'd been living was incomplete. When we parted, she hugged me briefly. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold. It was honest. I didn't know what our relationship would look like going forward, and for once, I didn't feel pressured to define it. What surprised me most in the aftermath was how light I felt. Not euphoric, not vindicated, just unburdened. For years, I had measured my value by how much I could absorb without complaint. Now I measured it by how clearly I could stand in my own space. People still misunderstood what happened. Some relatives thought I had planned everything meticulously to humiliate Emily. Others believed I had finally snapped. I didn't correct them. Truth doesn't need consensus to be valid. What mattered was this: when I walked into rooms now I didn't shrink. When I spoke, I didn't pre-edit myself for convenience. When I helped, it was because I chose to, not because it was expected. I hadn't won anything, but I had stopped losing myself, and that felt like the beginning of something I had never been allowed to have before. The real shift didn't happen in conversations. It happened in rooms I wasn't even in. I learned that slowly through fragments, comments that slipped out, pauses that stretched too long, decisions that suddenly required my input when they never had before. The first sign came from Daniel Harris. He called one afternoon and asked if I had time to stop by his office later that week. His tone was different from before, not urgent, not cautious, measured. "There's been a development," he said, "nothing adversarial, but something you should hear directly." When I arrived, my parents were already there. They sat on opposite ends of the conference table, not touching. That alone told me more than any opening statement could have. For years, they had been united by a shared assumption that I would absorb whatever was necessary to keep things stable. That assumption no longer held. Daniel laid out the facts calmly. The documents I had shared at the wedding had triggered a review, not just of that specific agreement, but of a series of decisions tied to it. Decisions that had quietly favored one child's momentum at the cost of another's flexibility. "No one broke the law," he said, carefully. "But there was reliance. And reliance creates obligation." My mother looked at her hands. My father stared at the wall behind me. "What does that mean?" my mother asked. "It means," Daniel replied, "that things can't continue as they have without acknowledgement. Financially, structurally, and frankly, ethically." That word, ethically, hung in the air. I said nothing. I didn't need to. For the first time, someone else was naming what I had lived inside for years. And they were doing it without emotion, without accusation. Just clarity. Over the next hour, practical changes were discussed. Adjustments, reallocations, not punishments, corrections. My parents listened, slowly, uncomfortably. At one point, my father cleared his throat. We didn't see it that way." "I know," I said quietly. "That's why it lasted so long." The meeting ended without resolution but with momentum. And momentum, I was learning, was more powerful than confrontation. Outside the office, my mother stopped me. "I feel like we failed you," she said, voice barely above a whisper. I looked at her, not with anger, not with comfort. "You didn't protect me," I said. "That's different." She nodded, tears gathering, but I didn't stay to watch them fall. Meanwhile, the ripple effects continued. Extended family dynamics shifted subtly. Invitations became more inclusive. Questions were asked carefully, respectfully. People who had once assumed I was simply the quiet one began to realize that quiet didn't mean absent. Emily felt it too. She told me later that the wedding, what should have been the cleanest, happiest milestone of her life, had become something else entirely in people's memories. Not scandalous, not ruined, but complicated. "They don't look at me the same," she admitted one evening when we spoke on the phone. "It's like they're re-evaluating things." I didn't apologize. I didn't want that, she added quickly. "I just wanted the day to be perfect." "I know," I said. "But perfection built on omission doesn't hold." She was quiet for a long time after that. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. People started asking me questions, not about the documents, about my life, what I was working on, what I wanted next, where I saw myself in 5 years. My parents asked tentatively if I needed help with anything. Not because they assumed I did, but because they finally realized they had never asked. I didn't rush to accept. Trust once redistributed takes time to settle. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt watching these shifts occur. There was no surge of validation, no sense of triumph, just alignment. For the first time, my internal reality matched the external one. I no longer had to minimize myself to maintain peace. I no longer had to translate my silence into cooperation. When I chose not to attend a gathering, it was received as a choice, not a default. Emily and I remained cautious with each other. Our conversations were honest but sparse. We were relearning the shape of our relationship without the old assumptions built in. One night she said something that stayed with me. "I keep thinking about that box," she said. "Not the papers. The fact that you didn't come, that you let it speak for you." I waited. "You always spoke like that," she continued. "I just never listened." That wasn't an apology, but it was awareness. And awareness, I was learning, was where real change began. The truth didn't explode. It didn't destroy the family. It didn't even divide us cleanly. It reorganized us. Power shifted not dramatically but unmistakably. Silence stopped being mistaken for consent. Support stopped being assumed. Presence stopped being optional. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't demanded anything. I had simply stopped hiding what already existed. And that, it turned out, was enough to change the room. The first time my parents said the word court, it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like fear. We were sitting in the same conference room at Daniel Harris's office, the same neutral space where emotions were contained by beige walls and legal language. This time there were more folders on the table, thicker ones, labeled, organized. Daniel spoke evenly as he always did. At this stage, no one is suing anyone. But given the scope of the reliance and the public disclosure, certain parties are advising documentation and formal acknowledgement. My mother clasped her hands tightly in her lap. My father leaned back, jaw set. "I don't understand how it got this far," my father said. "It was family. That's exactly why it got this far," Daniel replied calmly. Family arrangements often go undocumented because trust replaces structure. When trust becomes uneven, structure returns. No one looked at me. They didn't need to. For years, structure had existed everywhere except around me. I was the flexible piece, the variable that made the equation work without being written down. Now the math was visible. Emily wasn't at this meeting either. She had asked to be kept informed, not involved. That choice was telling. For the first time, she wasn't trying to control the narrative. Daniel outlined what would happen next if matters weren't resolved internally. Formal review, possible mediation, potential judicial oversight, not to punish but to clarify. The word judge hung in the air longer than it should have. My mother finally spoke. "Is that necessary?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at me instead. "That depends," he said gently, "on whether the person who carried the obligation feels fully acknowledged without it." Everyone turned toward me. This was the moment I had spent my life avoiding, the moment when the room waited for me to speak. I didn't rush. "I don't want a courtroom," I said finally. "I want accuracy." My father frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," I continued, "that what happened is named correctly. That decisions made quietly are recognized openly. And that expectations going forward are negotiated, not assumed." Silence followed, not the old kind that swallowed me, but the kind that waited. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "We never meant to take advantage of you." "I know," I said. "But intention doesn't erase impact." That sentence felt like crossing a line I had never been allowed to approach. Not aggressively, not angrily, just truthfully. Daniel nodded. "Then we have a path forward." The next weeks were methodical. There were meetings, revisions, calculations, paperwork that finally reflected reality instead of convenience. Some of it was uncomfortable. Some of it was humbling. For my parents, it meant confronting how much they had leaned on me without noticing. For Emily, it meant realizing that the life she had built had been partially supported by something she never questioned. She told me later that the hardest part wasn't the exposure, it was the realization that her success had never been as self-contained as she believed. "I don't know how to hold that," she said during one of our rare phone calls. "You don't have to hold it all at once," I replied. "Just don't deny it." Publicly, nothing dramatic happened. There was no headline, no viral moment, no public judgment. Privately, everything changed. The family dynamic recalibrated around facts instead of habits. Decisions required my consent now. Not as a formality, as a necessity. Invitations came with genuine options. Help was offered, not assumed. The most unexpected shift came from my father. One evening, after another long meeting, he asked if I wanted to take a walk. Just the two of us. We walked slowly through a nearby park, the sky dimming above us. "I thought I was being fair," he said after a while. "I thought giving you freedom was a gift." "It can be," I said, "if it comes with support." He nodded. "I didn't see how often you chose us over yourself." "I didn't either," I admitted. That was the closest we'd ever come to understanding each other. By the time everything was finalized, Documents signed, responsibilities clarified, expectations reset. The possibility of court had quietly disappeared, not because anyone won, because the truth had been acknowledged before it needed enforcement. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. There was no rush of justice, no dramatic release. Just the quiet certainty that I would never again have to prove my worth through silence. The system had intervened, not harshly, not publicly, but effectively. And for the first time in my life, I stood in my family, not as the one who endured, but as the one who mattered. After the legal clarity came something far more unsettling than conflict. Silence, not the kind that erases you, but the kind that forces everyone to sit with what they now know. The meetings ended. The documents were signed. The revisions were finalized. Daniel Harris stepped back, his role complete. There were no more deadlines, no more agendas, no more neutral rooms with carefully controlled language. What remained was us. My parents didn't call as often after that. Not out of avoidance, but uncertainty. They no longer knew what was expected of them, and for the first time they were afraid of assuming wrong. Emily retreated further inward. She canceled a planned family dinner, then another. She stopped posting altogether. When people asked how married life was going, she responded with polite vagueness. The version of her that had always moved confidently through rooms certain she belonged was adjusting to something unfamiliar. Accountability without applause. One evening she showed up at my apartment unannounced. I hadn't given her a key. She knocked softly, then harder when I didn't answer right away. When I opened the door, she looked smaller than I remembered, not physically but emotionally. Her posture lacked its usual certainty. I didn't know where else to go, she said. I stepped aside and let her in. She stood in my living room looking around like it was the first time she was really seeing how I lived. The modest furniture, the clean but unadorned space, the absence of anything extravagant. "This is nice," she said quietly. "It works for me," I replied. She sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped tightly together. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "I keep thinking about the wedding." I waited. Not the day she clarified. What came after? The looks, the questions. The way people stopped treating me like everything I touched was gold. Her voice cracked. "I didn't know how much of that came from you, holding things up behind the scenes." I didn't comfort her. I didn't correct her. I let her finish. "I thought being favored meant I was better," she continued. "I didn't realize it also meant I was protected from seeing things I should have seen." That was the first time she acknowledged the word without being prompted. "Favored. I'm not asking you to fix this," she added quickly. "I just needed you to know that I see it now." I nodded. "Seeing it is where it starts." She looked at me, eyes red. "Do you hate me?" The question surprised me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was vulnerable. "No," I said honestly. "I don't hate you." "Then why does it feel like I lost you?" I thought carefully before answering. "Because you're meeting me for the first time," I said. "Not the version that adapts to you." She swallowed hard. That night after she left, I sat alone and realized something important. For years I had believed that justice would feel loud, satisfying, clear. Instead, it felt like redistribution. Attention redistributed, responsibility redistributed, emotional labor redistributed. And that redistribution was uncomfortable for people who had never had to carry much of it before. My parents felt it too. They started asking questions they had never asked. "Do you want to come, or would you rather not? Is this something you're comfortable with? We can handle this if you're busy." At first, the questions irritated me. They felt clumsy, delayed. But then I understood they were learning a new language, one that didn't assume my availability as a default. One afternoon, my mother invited me over to help her reorganize old family photos. We spread albums across the dining table, flipping through decades of moments frozen in time. Birthday parties, graduations, holidays. Emily appeared in almost every frame, smiling brightly at the center. I appeared too, but usually on the edges, slightly turned away, holding something, standing behind someone else. My mother noticed it before I said anything. "I didn't realize," she whispered. "I did," I replied gently. "I just didn't know I was allowed to say it." She closed the album and covered her face with her hands. That was the moment she cried, not because she felt accused, but because she finally saw. And seeing came too late to undo the past, but just in time to change the future. I didn't forgive anyone in a single moment. Forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't a gesture. It was a process built on consistent behavior. And slowly behavior changed. Emily stopped asking me to smooth things over with our parents. She spoke for herself now, even when it was messy. My parents stopped narrating my life to others. They asked before sharing, and I stopped shrinking. The power shift wasn't dramatic. No one announced it. No one apologized publicly. But it was real. I was no longer the quiet structure holding everyone else upright. I was standing on my own. And for the first time, the family adjusted around me. By the time winter arrived, the sharp edges of what had happened began to dull, not because it was forgotten, but because it had settled into truth. Truth, I learned, doesn't stay dramatic forever. It becomes structural. It changes how people move, how they speak, how they make decisions when no one is watching. The holidays were the first real test. For as long as I could remember, Thanksgiving and Christmas followed the same script. Emily arrived late, full of stories. My parents hovered around her, proud and attentive. I helped in the kitchen. I set tables. I cleaned up quietly after everyone else had eaten and talked. This year was different before it even began. My mother called weeks in advance. "We're planning dinner," she said carefully. "I want to ask what would make it feel okay for you." The question caught me off guard. Not "will you come," not "can you help," not "please don't make this awkward." What would make it feel okay for you? "I don't want to host," I said after a moment. "And I don't want expectations placed on me without asking." She exhaled softly. "That's fair." When Thanksgiving came, I arrived to a house that felt tentative. The table was set, but no one was assigned roles. My mother cooked, my father helped. Emily brought dishes without being asked. At one point, my mother started to stand when dessert ended, instinctively moving toward the sink. Then she stopped, looked at me, and said, "We can all do this together." It was such a small thing, and it changed everything. Emily and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen later that night, rinsing plates side by side. The silence between us wasn't hostile. It was cautious, but real. "I still don't know how to talk about all of it," she admitted quietly. "You don't have to talk about everything," I said. "Just don't pretend nothing happened." She nodded. "I won't. That was enough for now." What surprised me most wasn't how my family changed, it was how I did. I noticed it at work first. In meetings, I stopped volunteering to absorb extra tasks just to keep things smooth. I waited. If something needed doing, I asked whether it fit my role. When I disagreed, I spoke calmly, directly, without apology. No one reacted badly. In fact, people adjusted quickly. As if they had been waiting for me to draw lines, they didn't know I was allowed to draw. Outside of work, I felt lighter in ways I couldn't quite explain. I slept better. I laughed more easily. I noticed how much energy I had been spending anticipating other people's needs, instead of listening to my own. I hadn't lost my kindness. I had lost my compulsion. My parents continued to stumble sometimes. Old habits don't disappear cleanly. There were moments when my mother slipped into asking for help in ways that assumed I would say yes. But now when I said no, the world didn't collapse. "Oh," she'd say, surprised. "Okay, we'll figure something else out." And they did. Emily struggled the most. She had built her identity around being admired, supported, elevated. Now she was learning how to exist without automatic reinforcement. Some days she handled it well. Other days she pulled back, defensive and distant. One evening she sent me a message I hadn't expected. "I think I'm grieving," it read. Grieving what I asked. The version of myself I thought was self-made. I stared at that sentence for a long time. "That doesn't mean you're not capable," I finally replied. "It just means you weren't alone," she responded almost immediately. "I don't know who I am without that illusion." I chose my words carefully. "You're someone who gets to choose differently now." She didn't reply after that, but the conversation didn't end there. It continued over weeks, slowly, unevenly. Not toward closeness, but toward honesty. And honesty, I was learning, didn't require intimacy to be meaningful. There were still consequences. Some relatives kept their distance, uncomfortable with what had been revealed. Others reached out quietly, sharing their own stories of being overlooked, of carrying weight in silence. I listened. Not as a savior, not as a symbol, just as someone who understood. The strangest part was this: I no longer needed anyone to fully understand my choices for them to feel right. For the first time, my sense of self wasn't contingent on being validated by the people who had once defined me. One night, months after the wedding, I opened the drawer where I used to keep the documents. The originals were no longer there. They had been filed, acknowledged, resolved. The drawer was empty. I left it that way. The absence felt symbolic. I hadn't won a battle. I hadn't exposed a villain. I hadn't reclaimed something stolen. I had simply stopped participating in a story that required my silence to function. And without that silence, the story had rewritten itself. Not into something perfect, but into something honest. Spring came quietly that year. Not with dramatic changes or symbolic breakthroughs, but with small, steady confirmations that something fundamental had shifted. I noticed it one afternoon while standing in line at a grocery store. A woman ahead of me apologized for taking too long fumbling with her wallet. Instinctively, I smiled and said, "Take your time." And I meant it not because I was used to waiting, but because I no longer felt like my time was less valuable than anyone else's. That distinction mattered. Life didn't transform overnight. My family didn't suddenly become emotionally fluent or perfectly balanced. Emily didn't reinvent herself. My parents didn't undo decades of habit. What changed was more subtle and more durable. Expectations stopped floating unspoken in the air. They had to be named now, negotiated, agreed upon. That alone altered everything. My parents invited me to dinner one evening, not for a holiday, not for a reason. Just dinner. When I arrived, there was no agenda, no favor waiting to be asked. Halfway through the meal, my father said something I never expected to hear. "We're proud of you," he said. "Not for what you did, for how you live." I didn't respond right away. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wanted to be sure I didn't rush to fill the space out of habit. "Thank you," I said finally. It was enough. Emily and I found a new rhythm, not closeness, not distance, but mutual awareness. We spoke occasionally, sometimes about mundane things, sometimes about deeper ones. The conversations were no longer built on performance or comparison. One evening she admitted something quietly. "I used to think silence meant agreement," she said. "I see now how wrong that was." I nodded. "A lot of people do." She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't offer a grand apology. What she offered instead was something more meaningful. She stopped assuming. That alone changed how we stood next to each other. The family gatherings that followed were different. Not warmer, not colder, truer. When I said no, it was accepted. When I said yes, it was appreciated. When I spoke, I wasn't interrupted. When I stayed quiet, it wasn't interpreted as consent. For the first time, I wasn't managing the room. I was simply in it. What surprised me most over time was how little I revisited the wedding itself. The memory faded, not erased, but softened. It became less about exclusion and more about transition. That day hadn't been the climax of my pain. It had been the end of my silence. And silence, once broken, doesn't return easily. I began to see the pattern everywhere, not just in my family, but in stories people shared with me. Friends, colleagues, strangers who felt unseen, undervalued, quietly indispensable. So many of us are taught that being easy is the same as being loved. It isn't. Being easy just makes it simpler for others to take up space. I didn't become louder. I didn't become harder. I didn't demand center stage. I became clear. Clear about my limits. Clear about my value. Clear about the cost of my cooperation. And that clarity reshaped every relationship that mattered. One afternoon, months later, I passed the venue where Emily had gotten married. I hadn't planned to. I was just walking, thinking, letting time move at its own pace. I stopped briefly across the street and looked at the building. There was no bitterness, no nostalgia, just recognition. That place marked the moment when the story everyone believed stopped being the only one that existed. I turned and walked away without looking back. Because the truth didn't need the past to validate it anymore. It lived in the present, in how I spoke, how I chose, how I stood. Quietly, fully, and finally upright.